Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, Triathletics. Today I want to break down Charlie Morton's mechanics and do something a little bit different. Treat this kind of similar to a previous Marcus Stroman breakdown that I did a couple of years ago, where I take you guys through step by step how we might break down a new pitcher that decides to work with us, and just showing you some of the different points and checkpoints that we look for. This is by no means an exhaustive list or saying that these are the only things that matter or that these are absolutes, but it does give us a good starting point for being able to look head to toe at how their body is moving down the mound and where some of these inefficiencies might be. Again, this initial phase of the process, we're just taking a look at different angles and we're just trying to see what things we might pick up that could be potential issues. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've already identified the underlying cause of those issues. It doesn't mean we've looked at which ones of these are kind of the symptoms versus which ones might be the underlying cause. So take that with a grain of salt. We're just identifying how they move and what we observe, and then pairing that with our movement screen, pairing that with their data, pairing that with their injury history, and actually talking to the athlete, and we can start to get a little bit better sense of, okay, which of these things maybe is a true problem that needs to be changed, and then what might that change or intervention be, and which of these are just kind of observations, but nothing really needs to be done. He's pitching well, he's throwing hard, he's commanding the ball well, etc., etc. So I thought Charlie Morton was just a good example of very high level pitching mechanics and just a very efficient mover. There's a couple very minor things that we can touch on, but again, he's a guy where I wouldn't recommend he change anything at this point from a purely mechanical standpoint. But again, let's just dive in, and hopefully you guys pick something up from this video. You can skip around by looking at the timestamps down below. This will be a little bit longer video, so this is again more for people who are trying to understand pitching mechanics in a little bit more detail and what constitutes efficient movement. So again, this is just what we've come up with, and hopefully you guys take something away from this. If you have any questions, comments, drop those down below, and let me know if you kind of look at pitching mechanics in a slightly different lens, and that's okay, and we can further that discussion down below. First thing that we kind of look for is in regards to starting position. So is he presetting that back foot? Where's his posture at? Typically, we're just taking note of some of the things here. Is he hooking the rubber? He's got a pretty standard starting position, no big issues there. We can see that he has a stable back foot position. He's relatively upright with the posture. Nothing crazy going on from that standpoint, at least with his initial position right there. So I gave him a good, really nothing I would change from that standpoint. Then we go into the leg lift and initial weight shift. So here's where a lot of things begin to break down from the very start in a lot of pitchers. So when we go through this move right here, this is again what I've been referring to for a number of years now as the drift. But at this point, really, we're looking for, during the leg lift, does he gain ground? So does his center of mass begin to initiate away from the rubber to some small extent? And I just tweeted about this a little bit, but Morton's a good example of how the drift really doesn't have to be this crazy forward move, right? There are guys with extreme initial moves, extreme drifts. Jacob deGrom, Nolan Ryan was a good example of this. But for a lot of guys, if they get too extreme with that first move and with that drift, they'll actually lose the backside. So they'll start falling down the mound and they actually aren't able to recapture control of their delivery, control of their lower half, and they lose that ground contact with the backside. But he's an example of a guy where you can see right there he does have some forward shifting of his center mass during that initial leg lift. But as he comes down out of it, you can see he still has full control of the direction to his delivery. He has full control of the backside. He has full control of his pelvic position and of being able to preload that tension in his pelvis and maintain that posture in his upper half. So we'll talk more about that in a second, but that's a good first move for him. The ideal amount of drift is going to be different depending on the guy, depending on how your back leg works, depending on your hip anatomy, depending on a lot of different factors. But suffice it to say, you want a little bit of a drift, a little bit of a forward move during that leg lift. And through experimentation, you'll be able to hone in on what exactly is the optimal amount for you. So again, that's one thing that we'll look at. I really like how he, again, out of the windup, he goes hands over the head. This is, you know, we talked about this before, but I really view that as kind of a bridge between the lower half and what the upper half is doing. So going hands over the head is one way to just add some flow, add some rhythm to the upper half, and allow the lower half to be building, allow the lower half to be you know, center stage in the delivery early on, whereas a lot of guys have a tendency to bring the arm into the throw too soon. Well, when you're allowing your lower half to be kind of center stage to the delivery, because your hands are going over the head, you actually don't have time to bring the hands into the throw, bring the arm action into the throw until a little bit later. So to me, I almost see going hands over the head as a way of delaying bringing the upper half into the throw a little bit too soon and adding that flow, adding that rhythm to the entire delivery. The other thing that I like to point out here, he's another example of a guy where he looks down, right? He gets the sign, you know, and then begins his delivery, but he looks down, he takes his eyes off the target, he changes his focal point, you know, he's looking somewhere down, you know, to the dirt, maybe to the grass, somewhere around here. But again, just changing the focal point ever so slightly, and then as he actually lifts, he picks up the target again. What I've seen consistently is that a lot of guys actually throw more strikes when they take their eyes off the target in this way. It shifts the focus for just a split second, and then when they pick it up, it's almost like an infielder fielding a ball, doesn't have time to think, and now they can deliver a strike to first base every single time. They're not pre-planning the movement. They're allowing that movement to emerge and allowing them to tap into their natural athleticism a little bit more naturally, a little bit more readily, because they aren't just tunnel vision on the catcher the entire time. Some people's you know, minds work like that, and they can just stay tunnel vision on the target the entire time. Myself and a lot of other guys just are not able to do that, and so breaking the focus for a split second is a very common way to be able to kind of circumnavigate around that issue and still be able to tap into your natural athleticism and actually have more consistency in terms of what you're doing. So that's the leg lift and initial weight shift. As we begin to drop into the back leg, there's a number of things that we're looking for. So the first one I wrote down here is engaging the rear glute. So what we're looking for as he comes out of peak leg lift, right, this is more of a kind of a floating move, right? He's not really accepting a ton of weight into the back leg at this point, right? It's a dance move. It's a controlled fall, if you want to think of it that way. But right here, as he drops into his back leg, out of that initial move, out of that weight shift, now he's in the rear hip. And so what we're kind of looking for, if I can go to the front view here, we're looking for a hinge. So we're looking for a little bit of a forward trunk posture. Again, that exact posture is going to be somewhat different depending on the arm slot that the guy throws. So a way over the top guy, he's going to be holding more of an upright torso posture, and you know, the lower slot guy is going to be holding more of a forward torso posture, and that's okay. But we're trying to look for this involvement of the rear hip, the rear glute, right through here. So we saw him completely upright, completely back, completely early extended, heel up, way into his toe, way into his quad. You know, that's something that makes it a lot more difficult to actually be able to rotate out of, and the default move out of that tends to be early extension of the back, ankle, knee, and hip. And again, triple extension is not what the hardest throwers in the world do. So again, good there. We're looking for pushing, overextending the back leg. Now, what you might see with some guys is they get to this position right here and they just continue to extend. So they get right into the peak of their kind of linear move, peak of their drive, and the very next thing is to kind of jump off the rubber, and so they'll get that extension of the knee, hip, and ankle. And what we actually want to see instead is we want to see this knee moving in this downward direction. So we want to see the hips begin to uncork into landing at the last second, and that's actually going to drive down that entire leg spiral. So you can see right there, he's not getting overextended. It's actually very obvious from the front view. So he gets to the peak of his linear move right here, and he rotates. He rotates versus extending, and you can again see that flexion that he's actually holding in the back hip as he begins to uncork that into landing. So he's not pushing or overextending the back leg. Vertical shin angle versus early hip IR. This isn't something that's necessarily a right or wrong answer. This is going to be a lot more dependent on the particular athlete's hip anatomy and what works best for them. But we're looking at and we're just observing, is this a guy that holds his weight a little bit further back and holds a little bit more of a vertical shin, ER or external rotation dominant backside? Or is it a guy who's relying heavily on that internal rotation? And it's much more of like a knee-to-knee position where he's creating more of a lateral, more of a horizontal angle with that back shin angle. So again, there's hard throwers that do it both ways. We talk a lot about the extremes on both ends of the spectrum, but in fact, a lot of pitchers fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, where they're, a Fernando Rodney type, Tanaka, Edwin Diaz, guys that are heavily internal rotation dominant, Justin Verlander, where he's heavily external rotation, vertical shin dominant. A lot of guys actually fall somewhere in between, and I believe Charlie Morton is somewhere in between. I imagine if you were to screen him, he's a guy who probably has decent hip external and decent hip internal rotation, and so again, his patterns kind of reflect that. You can see he gets a little bit, he reaches open a little bit with that lead hip, right? That's oftentimes what you will see in guys that have, fairly good hip external rotation, is they'll get to this point in their delivery and they'll kind of clear that lead hip a little bit early, and so that's what he's doing. But at the same time, from this view, you can see that he's not really a vertical shin guy. He's establishing, a little bit of angle here with that shin angle. So again, you would need to kind of establish from a movement screen, what type of range of motion they actually have in their hips, and kind of cross-reference that to how they're actually using their lower half of the mound. But guys throwing upper 90s, having success, you can be relatively certain that his body is moving in an efficient way for him. So this is not something that I would necessarily want to change. We look at next, staying in the heel, not rising onto the toes early. So this is a huge one. We can see this from the first base view the best, but take a look at the back foot, right? As he lifts his leg, is that back foot spinning on him? Is he rolling into supination? Is he rolling onto the outside of the foot? No. Is he completely caving in at this point? No, he's flat, he's grounded, he's holding that tripod, he's holding that stable position on the back foot. And then as he drops into the back leg, is he immediately coming onto the toe? Again, some guys do better, allowing the hips to clear a little bit more. They're gonna be a little bit more into the toe. And then others do better where they allow the heel to stay in contact a little bit longer. So there is some individuality to what I'm talking about here. But in general, guys that can hold that backside longer and be able to delay that rotation until the last second. In general, as long as they can still get open into landing and still clear the hips, if you can delay that a little bit longer before snapping it open, you're able to generate more potential velocity, more potential torque from that standpoint. So again, he's holding the heel staying down, and then at the last second, just before landing, he's able to unleash the pelvis, and again, that's working its way down that back leg spiral, pulls the heel off the ground, and allows that foot to turn over into landing. So another example where he's very efficient from that standpoint. If we look at the next point, directionality of drive. So we can see this from the front view a little bit better. Again, this is something that's a little bit individual. In general, you're not going to see a ton of throwers that stride open, that land all the way over here. That just typically is not the case. You're going to see pitchers who land either straight on to the target or a little bit close. There are guys where it works very well for them to land extremely cross-body. Those guys are in the minority, and most of the time those guys will have already been doing that for most of their career. And then the question is, should we change it or not? But in most cases, if you take a guy who's striding on target and you tell him to throw cross-body, unless that's a pattern they've naturally adopted themselves over time, I found that can, most cases, that doesn't work out too well. It feels very unnatural, very uncomfortable, velocity drops. But if it's a scenario like a Jake Arrieta scenario with the Orioles, where he was always a crossbody guy and they were trying to change him back to on target, sometimes that can be a mistake as well. But in general, we're just looking at it and observing what's going on here. And again, he's pretty straight on, pretty on line, where he's landing right about in line with the ball of that back foot. So don't really see any huge issues as far as the directionality of his drive from the drive standpoint. If he was blade cross body, then the question might be, well, has he always done that, or did he just start doing that? as a result of XYZ injury history, ankle sprain on the back foot, hip issue, FAI, like is something going on that's suddenly affecting his directionality, or has this been something he's had success with for a long time? So again, we're just making observations at this point. We're not necessarily saying this has to be changed. This is the best thing ever, this is the worst thing ever. We're just kind of know generally what works for the vast majority of hard throwers, and we're observing whether they're falling into these categories or not. Lateral versus, we can talk about coming out of drive early. Again, you'll see some of these are very linked, and are, in general, if they do a number of these things well, they're going to do other facets well too, because again, these are all very closely linked pieces of the kinetic chain. But coming out of drive early, really here we're looking at the pelvis. We're looking at the back leg, but we're primarily looking at the pelvis. So you can see he's holding a closed pelvis, his belt buckle is facing towards third base, and we're seeing how long can he hold the back leg, how long can he ride his center of mass forward down the mound before allowing it to unleash, allowing it to uncork. It's not just this constant leg lift, opening of the pelvis, swinging the gait. It's loading tension, riding it down the mound, and then being able to pop it open into landing at the last second. So he's riding it, he's riding it. And right about here, there is when he begins to uncork into landing. So he's able to ride his pelvis and ride that backside very, very well down the mound. This is a good example of holding the backside until the last second and then unleashing that into landing at the last second. Some guys get right here, and then their next move is to immediately begin swinging the gait, and their pelvis begins to open up early. And so they didn't actually hold any coil or any tension in that back leg spiral up through the pelvis. So they don't really have anything to unleash into landing, if that makes sense. Lateral versus vertical ground reaction force. So this is similar to the vertical shin position we already talked about. But is he a guy who stays stuck over the rubber and his shin is vertical the entire time as he moves forward? These are the guys that typically you see get very, very uphill. Or is he actually creating some lateral force into the rubber? So somebody who has a vertical shin can still create a lateral force if they have a proper drift. Justin Verlander is a good example. He's a little bit more of a vertical shin guy, but he shifts his weight so well, and so gets such an aggressive first move that when he actually does drop down into his back hip, he's still creating that lateral, more lateral force vector. But if he just was straight balance point, stayed completely stuck over the rubber with a vertical shin, then all the force he's putting into the ground is being lost. It's going straight up. We're trying to apply a more horizontal force into the ground so that we can actually gain ground towards the target and build potential energy that way. So again, he's doing that. We've already covered that. If a guy drifts well, so if they have that forward move and if they drop into a stable back foot position and they can ride that, you can see where's that force going. That force is going back in this direction into the ground. Back knee drives down into landing. So once they get to kind of the peak or the apex of their linear move, so you're going to be able to ride your center mass until you can't anymore. Or you're going to be able to ride. At some point, you're going to run out of room, run out of range of motion, whether that's in the back ankle, being able to hold the ground, whether that's in the tibia, whether that's in the femur, whether that's in your groin, doesn't have the ability to be able to go any further in that stride. You're going to run out of room at some point, and it's going to trigger that uncoiling of that tension. What you're going to see is guys that rotate well. Just another indicator of that, which we talked about, is that back knee is going to look like it's just driving straight down to the ground. And again, it's really the pelvis having held tension and then pelvis uncoiling, and that coil working its way down the leg spiral. And again, that knee is just pulled down into landing. But if you can see right here, where does that knee go? Right down here. Let's track the knee. So knee is driving down. You can actually see this better from the front view. And from like broadcast views, back views, it's pretty easy to see this too on guys if they're getting super extendy. But you can see that knee is driving down, and that's just an indication that rotation is happening. He's not jumping, he's not catapulting himself off the rubber with his quad, but he's rotating, he's holding tension, he's rotating through the hips, through the pelvis. And so what it looks like is the back knee driving down into landing. It's not actually him thrusting his knee down into landing, but that's the effective kind of visual of what happens. And then foot maintains ground contact at release. Again, there are a lot of guys who actually don't do this, who throw upper 90s. But in general, if you can get the hips clear and segment well, you're not going to see this back foot shoot 2 feet off the ground and kick way in. So again, you can see that he is in contact with the ground at ball release. As the hips have kind of done their job, you want to see that energy work its way up through the rest of the kinetic chain. You don't want to see a ton of motion continuing to happen at the lower half and at the back foot at this position. So it's going to get dragged through a little bit, but you don't want to see this big kicking in of the knee forwards and this big elevation of that back foot way off the ground. A little bit's okay, but again, it's kind of all on a spectrum, and it is somewhat individual dependent. We work our way into the pelvis, hips clear into landing. This is a little more individual, right? Some guys are going to do better having their hips a little bit more rotated by landing, like 60, 70 degrees open. Some guys are going to do better, kind of more where Morton is, somewhere in that 45-degree line. You can kind of see where the belt buckle is facing here. Somewhere around 45 degrees. If this is 90, or this is 0, this is 90, he's somewhere around 45 degrees. So a little bit more on the kind of the closed side at landing, but you're going to be somewhere in this range to this range in general. So if he was landing with his hips still completely facing third base, he's just going to be crashing into his lead leg. We would see him landing probably sideways on that lead foot. You'd see this lead foot landing way closed. Some guys just don't clear the hips that well into landing, so there does need to be some degree of rotating into landing. It doesn't mean that there's a common cue of basically wait to throw until front foot contact, or delay rotation until after landing. That's more of a feel than the actual reality. The reality is that there is pelvic rotation down into landing, right? He's closed here, belt buckle facing over here, and he's able to rotate down into landing, right? That doesn't mean that it might not be a helpful cue for some guys to think, hey, let's delay everything into landing. It's just recognizing like that is more of a feel versus real thing. Like when you hear Alex Rodriguez talk about swinging down to the ball, and then you look at him and any clip of him swinging, and he was actually swinging up at contact. Feels can be extremely useful for generating the reel that we're going for. But as a coach, just being able to recognize and dissociate whether we're talking about a feel or whether we're looking at what actually is going on. So it might still be helpful to tell somebody not to delay rotation until landing if that creates the pattern and the results that we're after. Rotating down versus spinning into landing. Again, we've kind of talked about this. This is linked to towards kind of the back, seeing what the back knee is doing. But spinning into landing, is that rotation happening in more of this kind of downwards plane, or is he spinning completely off? And you'll usually see this as well. You'll see this manifest itself in terms of what the upper half does and what the lead knee does. If this lead knee shoots way off to the side, if the front foot starts spinning out, and if there's a really aggressive trunk yank and head yank, typically that's a sign of the rotation of their hips into landing was less down into landing, and it was more just spinning way off to the side. And so you'll see that more manifest itself in other parts of the chain. But he's doing a good job of rotating down into landing. This is going to be more apparent in higher slot guys. So guys who are more north to south, it's going to be a little bit more apparent how their hips actually work into landing. Clayton Kershaw would be a good example of that. He's not just spinning his hips this way, it's more of a replacing his front hip with his back hip and being able to rotate in the same plane as the rest of his body will be working. So rotating the hips into landing in the same plane that rotation is going to be occurring. You can think of it, again, like I talk about all the time, you can think of this as a tornado of energy. You're holding tension, holding tension, holding tension, and then you unleash it. And you want this tornado to be able to work its way through the body, bleeding as little energy as possible and being able to maintain that same plane up through the hips, up through the torso, through the spine, and then ultimately out into the arm and into the ball. Okay, so we move on from here. Rotating down, we talked about that, moves independently of the torso. So when thinking about one of the most common flaws in pitch mechanics is the hips and the shoulders rotate together. So guys aren't able to create dissociation. And so rather than being able to create this whip-like mechanism through their pelvis and through their spine. They're basically just rotating like one big board where everything is just stuck together and moving in unison. And again, the main place that happens is the pelvis and the trunk are not able to dissociate. They're not able to move independently of one another. So one of the things we'll look for here is when the hips do begin to rotate, what's happening at the spine, what's happening in the upper back, lower back. So we want to see some differentiation between the hips going without the shoulders coming with it. So is he able to get the hips open without the shoulders completely yanking open? And the answer is yes. So it's that action right there. Hips go. You can see that energy begin to work its way up into his, low back, upper back, but he's still able to stay relatively closed with the upper half while clearing the hips into landing. So that's what we look for. Some guys, it all comes completely together. Again, it's on a spectrum. There's guys that delay trunk rotation extremely well. Dylan Cease is a good example. Guys with extraordinary thoracic mobility and hip mobility can delay this even more. And it's typically the guys that are extremely stiff, really rigid spines. They aren't able to move independently kind of through their hips and through their spine. And so a lot of times that is both a potential mobility issue, but is also a motor control issue. So it's a skill that needs to be learned, but you can't learn that skill if your body doesn't even have the capability of moving in that way. If it doesn't have access to this potential movement solution, no amount of patterning it or drill work or cueing is going to fix it if you don't fundamentally have the range of motion and the mobility available in your body, available in your joints, through your spine, through your hips. Go to torso now. One of the things we look for is excessive counter rotation. You can think of someone like a Madison Bumgarner, where he's completely counter rotated. He's showing his numbers to the target. Can work from an effectiveness standpoint, from a pure energy transfer, velocity generation standpoint. There's a reason you typically don't see the hardest throwing guys have that much counter rotation. It's really hard to set that type of position and then still be able to get out of that position with good timing, rotate down into landing, and then sync that all up, right? Madison's a guy who's well above average levers, strength, big dude, and he's throwing very, very slow relative to where he could be. And again, not to pick on him, but in general, we see guys who have this over counter rotation move at somewhere in their delivery have trouble getting out of that position. So just an observation that we look for. Again, he's not over counter rotated by any stretch. Early torso rotation. Again, he does a pretty good job delaying trunk rotation. Some would say he's a hair open here, but you need to look at, there's a difference between what the glove arm is doing and where the actual trunk is. So his trunk is, lost the cursor. So his trunk is right around in this plane, right here. So you almost have to look at like the line drawn like between his AC joints would be more of his like true trunk angle. Whereas glove arm, his trunk is not actually rotated this far, so he's relatively closed. Could you be nitpicky and say, well, I actually want him, even more closed by 5 degrees? You could. And if he was throwing 89, 91, and said, I used to throw 95, and you looked at old video and he was doing that, then you could make a logical conclusion that, hey, we need to stay a little bit more closed. He's throwing 95, 98. He's stuff is as good as it's ever been from that standpoint. So you probably aren't changing anything from that standpoint. It is more of a spectrum. So if he was already open 35, 40 degrees at landing, again, he's not getting any of that dissociation, and he's not capturing any of that whip-like mechanism through his hips, through his spine. But in his case, that's really not an issue whatsoever. Again, we're just using him as kind of like a learning template, an example of a good mover, so that you guys can kind of see some of the issues. And I'm going to be breaking down in a future video examples of some of your pitching mechanics, so your viewers submitting video, so you guys can see some of these flaws and see how they actually exhibit themselves in the delivery, where these kind of distortions can actually happen. Torso doesn't segment from pelvis, so again, really same thing as the pelvis moving independently of the torso, so we're not going to cover that right now. Bowflex bow, That's a Paul Nyman phrase, which again kind of refers to delaying early trunk extension. So he used that to refer to, like, the bow is this initial kind of forward trunk posture, posterior pelvic tilt. The flex is rotating into landing, getting into extension, and the final bow is as you rotate, you come back into more of a bowed position, more thoracic flexion. So thoracic flexion, extension, rotation takes you back into thoracic flexion. So just kind of a way to refer to that kind of wave-like analogy. How I interpret that and how I look at it is seeing guys be able to maintain that trunk stack, whether they're stacked in more of an upright posture, and be able to delay the actual extension and rotation until landing, versus the guys who they never have that forward trunk tilt, they never have that stack, and they just, before they even get into landing, they're already completely extended. So when they land, where are they supposed to go? They're already extended and they just spin this way, versus being able to delay that a little bit longer. I just talked to one of my big league starters about this, and he's seen a little velocity uptick through actually being able to feel this and focus on this. He was extending early into landing, being able to hold that trunk stack a little bit longer until landing, and then allow that energy as soon as the hips actually go. Now you allow that to wind its way through and create that extension for you, versus artificially leaning back, trying to yank the upper half or open early, or yank into extension early is what you'll see. So again, he's holding that forward trunk posture. Ben Joyce is a great example of this. He's holding that trunk posture, and he's allowing the hips to wind, to open it for him. So he's allowing the rotation of, he's holding this, he's holding that trunk stack, and he's allowing the pelvic rotation to be the thing that opens up the upper half, and to be the thing that allows him to then get into extension. So he's not extending early into landing. Pretty important distinction. Scapular dig, engaging the lateral line. When we talk about scapular dig, or front view is probably easiest. This is a javelin term, but we're really looking at, again, just how the sequence of this energy working its way up the chain. We don't want segments further along in the chain to come in too early. So when it comes to the arm, we don't want the arm to be the thing leading the way. We want the arm to be on time, but wait till the hips go, trunk goes, and now the last thing to go is the arm. And so the dig is basically this ability of the arm to lag behind a hair, where the arm is up on time, trunk goes, arm lags just a hair, and we get this reflexive stretch through the chest. The scap basically stays behind as the trunk goes, and then it gets slingshots through from that point. So I'm trying to look at not just this degree of retraction, degree of scap loading, but then as he begins to rotate, does it lag slightly behind, and does he get this stretch? So you can see he does. This is linked to the next one, which is reflexive pec fire. These are linked, but what am I looking for? I'm looking for, does the arm get into retraction, and then as he rotates, again, where's his shoulder angle and where's his arm? Is his arm able to actually lag behind the rotation and get pulled, boom, right there? Now his arm gets pulled into that line of the torso. Or is his elbow the thing leading the way, or is his elbow staying back, and trunk rotation pulls it back into plane? And that's where you get this big slingshot-like effect from the pec, from the lats, and from the upper half. So he's doing a very good job of that. Arm slop matches torso rotation. At landing, where's the elbow? A lot of guys will be way down at their side if they have a low elbow. Some guys will be, hiked way up here, hiked way up here. Ideally, we want to see the elbow and the humerus in line with the shoulders at landing. And again, even if their shoulder, this is different from the shoulders being a little bit uphill, but the elbow being in plane. So the elbow in plane, elbows in plane in all of these examples right here. In plane, in plane, in plane. So that's different from the shoulders being level and the elbow down here. Right, so we're looking for, is the elbow actually in plane, so that when the pitcher begins to rotate, he's able to maximally transfer all of that rotational energy out and around into the arm and actually get as much of that as possible out into the ball. So he's doing a good job there. We can look at it from a couple different angles. Front angle is probably the easiest. So not just at landing, but as he begins to rotate and the arm spirals out, we can see plane of the shoulders. Where's the arm? Boom, right in plane, directly in line, directly in line. Arm continues to spiral out, directly in line. Again, if we're a little bit up overhead with this shot that we took, but being able to get a little bit lower, again, you would see elbow, ball. I mean, we're very close to being directly in plane with how the shoulders are actually rotating. Rotates perpendicular to spine. This is linked to the last one. So we're looking at this point. Where is that rotation occurring? And some guys, they get to this point in their throw and it becomes a forward flexing of their trunk versus a rotation around their spine. So if they have more of an upright trunk posture, right, just kind of like straight upright, then rotation around their spine would be like this. If they're extremely extended at landing, like maybe a Tim Lincecum or over the top pitcher like an Ian Anderson, if they're way here, then rotation around their spine is going to deliver their arm at a higher slot. If they're more hunched over at landing, rotation around their spine is going to deliver their arm in a lower slot. But essentially what we're not looking to see is that they get to this point in their throw and they just forward flex. So they lose that rotation around their spine and they turn it into a linear finish to the throw. When that linear action happens with the trunk, the back knee kicks forward, the back foot kicks off the mound, and the elbow begins to push out front. So it becomes more of a forward flexing finish versus a block, dissociate, and violently rotate over a firm front side, if that makes sense. Excessive tilt, rotation into release. So we're looking at ball release. You know, is the chest facing way over towards first base? Is his head yanking way off to the side? Is he hanging his arm out to dry? Or is he roughly in plane with his arm, with his trunk, with the ball? And he's gonna have a little bit of continued rotation over the lead leg. That's okay. You can see his chest is facing lefty batter's box. You just don't necessarily want to always see guys that they're beginning to drag on the front of their shoulder, beginning to drag on their bicep, beginning to drag on their elbow, and they're way over rotating. A lot of times that'll be an issue with their stride direction or an issue with the angle of how this front foot actually lands. So they don't take out all the slack in that lead leg, so they don't actually ever get to a firm lead leg block to deliver the trunk. That knee continues to bow out, or they maybe land too open with this foot, or they're striding too open, and so it takes their direction way off to the side, and now they've lost direction to the throw, and so you can see that at ball release where they're way over rotated with their trunk. Again, he doesn't do that at all. Throwing uphill, shoulder tilt. So to be able to actually get downhill, now this would be a different story if pitching was an uphill activity. If this was a long toss competition, we'd be looking for a different ideal trunk angle, at landing and into release. But the fact of the matter is, you're typically not going to see guys that throw extremely hard, that have 45-degree uphill trunk tilts at landing. They're just not going to be able to get back down over their front side if at landing they're way back here. They're just not going to be able to do it as well. There are guys who are like this. They typically are not the 100-mile-an-hour guys. There are some exceptions, but generally the higher slot pitchers can get away with a little bit more upwards tilt as long as they can still find a way to get back downhill at ball release. The issue is when guys land too uphill, their body knows they can't get back downhill in time and actually rotate. And so they get in this position and then they just cash out, drag the arm from there. So way uphill, and then they just cash out, or way uphill, and then the elbow shoots forward. And again, it becomes a pushing or a more of a linear finish. So ideally what we want to see is into landing, shoulders fairly even, plus or minus 10 degrees, with level. And that's going to allow them to actually have the timing to be able to get from here and actually get back downhill and get on top of the ball. One of the issues when it comes to repeatability, especially on off-speed pitches, I had this issue a lot myself as a lower slot guy, where my arm slot has kind of varied over the years from a little below sidearm to around where Morton is. It's very difficult to throw a good breaking ball when you're just below it and behind it, just below and under it rather. As soon as you get a little bit downhill and you can actually get, sorry you guys can't really see my fingers, but as soon as you get on top of the pitch, it's a lot easier to create depth on breaking pitches. I mean, anyone who's pitched before knows this. But that's kind of separate from just pure velocity generation standpoint, but also with the ability to actually create good action on pitches, depth on a changeup, depth on a split change, depth on a curveball, depth on a slider, be able to locate balls down in the zone. Another thing you'll see, guys who land uphill, again, their planes are off. Their planes are off. You'll see this sometimes with guys who do a lot of long toss, but don't necessarily prioritize their pull downs, is they train their angle to be uphill. And so they'll start sailing balls up in the zone a lot, especially up in the zone and arm side. So again, just some general trends. There are guys, if a guy's throwing 98 and he's a little uphill and it's working for him, I'm not necessarily going to change it. I have seen those guys, they're usually 6'6 plus, they're usually monsters and they're making up for it in other ways, but it doesn't mean you have to change it. It just means it's an observation. It's probably a minor inefficiency. But again, just because something is minor inefficiency doesn't mean we have to go in and change it until we understand the repercussions of making that change. So let's move on to the throwing arm now. From a throwing arm standpoint, we look at a number of things here. The first one is, does that arm swing capture momentum? So I like to think of the throwing arm as that first phase of the arm swing as kind of a pendulum action. We all know what a pendulum is, but looking at that action, like how well do they capture the momentum from the top of the pendulum and allow it to swing to the other end of the pendulum? Stabbing, short, choppy, abbreviated moves, guys who just come out of their glove immediately and stab. Now they have to pretty much manufacture all that momentum again because they didn't actually stay loose and capture any of that from the downswing of the handbrake. So Morton actually is a guy where you can see right here, he has a little bit of a stab, boom, right there, and then he picks it up and continues. I have a feeling this is something that he subconsciously has kind of adopted as a way to, potentially cheat his way to better positions at ball release on some of his off-speed pitches. So again, he's maybe not necessarily optimizing for throwing 101, but he's maybe found like presetting a little bit of supination or getting to some of these positions a little bit early. Roger Clemens is a guy that I broke down and looked at how his arm path evolved over the course of his career. He did this a lot better early on in his career, like when he was a college pitcher, when he threw harder. But he actually adopted a little bit of like a mini stab, like a way worse stab than Morton has. Morton is very, very slight. But he adopted like a little bit of a stab once he started throwing the splitter. And so my theory is this might be a subconscious thing, might be a way that, just being able to find his way to get preset or get on top of certain pitches or get to different points at ball release with certain pitches. So I have no doubt that this is probably something that he's not trying to do, but is helping him with execution in some way. So again, I would be careful immediately changing that, but at the same time, we've had guys that we've coached, like Mitch Keller would be an example. He's a guy where his arm action had gotten a little short, a little choppy, a little compact, and wasn't able to relax that well compared to in the past. And just giving him a couple movements, not over coaching it, allowing him to be a little bit more free and easy and flow through the arm swing. For him, that was a velocity unlock, and that's why he's been up to 100, this year, and he's gained a few ticks. There's a lot more to it, to performance, than just that, but sometimes it's worth changing, sometimes it's not. Try to understand the context, but that's arm swing captures momentum. Overly pronated or supinated. So again, it's going to depend a little bit on the pitch, but he's really neither. Overly supinated, I mean, these would be guys that are fully supinated out of the glove, where that might be an issue. We want to have a conversation, why is that happening? Or guys who are completely stabbing behind their body and torquing into pronation. Those are guys, again, they're putting a lot more tension through their flexor pronator mass, and also just when they have that level of tension at the end of the whip, right, at the end, that much tension in their wrist, their hand, the ball, their forearm, there's going to be more tension up the chain too. You can't have that degree of tension in your arm and a stab and not also hold tension in your scap, all the scap muscles, your upper trap, your lat, your pec. So relaxation goes hand and muscling up. Down the chain affects up the chain also affects down the chain. So that's really where the concern is that these guys are often holding, you know, if that were the case, holding more tension through their throwing arm. And he doesn't do that. He doesn't have an overly flexed or extended wrist at any point, so he's not hooking the ball. He's also not getting into layback and cranking into extension. So he's keeping that wrist relaxed. You can see relatively neutral wrist, neutral, 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 neutral. There's going to be, again, as the arm lays back, there's going to be a little bit of wrist extension because you actually want the center point of the ball to be the thing that's in line with the ulna, with the forearm bone. So again, you can see right here, we look at the ulna and radius, we look at the forearm. When we kind of draw a line through the elbow, through the forearm, what is that lined up with? That's lined up with the dead center with the baseball. So the fingers are actually going to be a little bit, the wrist is going to be in a little bit of an extended position just for that standpoint. But again, some guys that are really tight, they'll be cranking into crazy wrist extension as the arm comes through because they're trying to manufacture layback. They don't have the ability to get true ball and socket layback at their shoulder. Their scap doesn't work, their spine doesn't work. And so you'll sometimes see really aggressive wrist extension or wrist flexion and hooking of the wrist during the initial arm swing. Elbow in line with the shoulders at landing, yes, we already talked about that. So he's able to get in plane. Again, you don't need to know, I mean, he might be plus or minus 2 degrees, 3 degrees, like we don't have an exact reading on this, but again, we're looking for these major inefficiencies where that elbow is a baseball below where it is right now or a baseball above where it is right now. And that's where a lot of the major inefficiencies come from, right? There's going to be mild amounts of variation pitch to pitch and throw to throw. No matter what, that's unavoidable. It's impossible to actually repeat a movement pattern the exact same way 2 times in a row. We don't need to get into that right now, but there's going to be a little bit of variation, and that's okay. Late or early flip up. This is another thing that, you know, one might consider dinging him on if he were, you know, if you thought this could be a problem. This is something where you might argue that he's a little bit late at landing, but again, it's debatable because he's within mostly within the ranges that we look for. So when we're looking at the arm timing at landing, we talk about the flip up. The flip up is really what I've talked about to refer to the forearm flipping up behind the head, flipping up behind the body on time before the shoulders begin to go. So we're looking at somewhere between straight vertical and 45 degrees. If he landed and his arm was way down here, or even worse, way down here, then as he would begin to rotate, his arm would be a lot later getting up, and it would have to be going into layback. It would have a very short window to actually go into layback and actually go into internal rotation and get out of that position into landing. By having a properly timed flip up, he's able to actually get the arm in a good position to accept that layback as he begins to rotate. Versus here, as he begins to rotate, you're not hitting it until later. You're not hitting that peak layback until later. And typically what happens is the elbow shoots forward. It becomes more of a tricep driven movement, and you lose a lot of that whip-like mechanism. And again, he's got really good scap retraction, really good, but he's around 45 degrees. With that timing, he's on that very kind of lower end of what we might look for. He's throwing well. You know, from a velocity standpoint, stuff's moving. Like, it's not something you'd probably change, but that is something where in a perfect world, you might want to see it more like 60, 70 degrees at that point. Again, somewhat debatable, probably not worth changing. Elbow flexion, 90 degrees plus or minus 10 degrees. You can see he's dead on 90 degrees right there. So guys who drag their arms, guys who are way outside 90, and they begin to rotate through here, they're just not able to get as much of that energy into the ball and actually get that spiraling like effect. But at the same time, guys who are way inside 90, way supinated, in general, those guys tend to lead the elbow forward, so they don't actually create the same degree of layback from here and the same whip-like mechanism than when they're roughly at 90 degrees. There's some variation there. I put plus or minus 10 degrees. You do see hard throwers who are a little bit inside. You do see hard throwers who are a little bit outside. You're just not going to see guys that are way out here at landing, way in here at landing. In general, there are some exceptions. There are some Corey Kluvers that are, way inside 90 and can still throw low to mid 90s. Again, you look at the vast majority of the most efficient throwers in the world from a velocity generation standpoint, especially relative to their body size, you're going to see them around 90 degrees more times than not. Full scap retraction and abduction, we did touch on this one already. Now full is kind of subjective, but we're looking for the ability to actually get the scaps roughly touching. They're like, can they actually get full scap retraction? Are the elbows behind the body? Are they getting this scap pinch? And ideally, is that arm flipped up? And he's actually a really good example of this. He's open through the thoracic spine. He's open through the chest. Guys who are super tightly wound through their chest aren't able to get into some of these positions. And again, you're gonna have guys that they're such good athletes and they're a little bit more tight movers. They don't have to get into this type of position. Shohei Ohtani is an example of that, to still find a way to throw hard. But in general, this is going to be a correlated piece to high level throwing. Again, if you're able to get in some of these positions while keeping the trunk closed, while getting the front foot down, while getting hips open and dissociating everything, you're potentially going to be applying force to the baseball over a longer arc of motion, a longer range of motion from that standpoint than if his humerus, his upper arm bone, was in this position right here. Okay, so that's all it is, just as an indicator. Arm drag, we talked about that, so not being way outside of 90 degrees. When that happens, now as a pitcher begins to rotate, the arm kind of drags. It's no longer in that plane of rotation and laying back. It's kind of just getting dragged through, and you end up getting a lot more of a shear or stretch through the bicep tendon, through the anterior shoulder capsule as well. Limited layback. We've talked about this before, but layback, you're going to be looking somewhere between 170 and 190 degrees of layback. You can kind of eyeball this to see how their arm moves, because again, there is some variation in terms of this. But generally, if it's a guy that is, his layback is like non-existent, like as he begins to rotate, his arm doesn't get past, 45 degrees of layback, that's not going to be a guy that throws hard, right? That's not an arm that functions as the tip of the whip. The arm is the tip of the whip. The rest of the body is the kind of handle and mid portion of the whip. If your arm isn't loose and mobile, it's not going to function as well as a whip, obviously. But what goes into layback, again, it partly is the degree of range of motion that you have at the actual ball and socket joint, at the actual glenohumeral joint, but it's also partly the ability of your scapula to tilt. It's the ability of your scap to tilt, to get out of the way, to allow that arm to actually come through, and it's also the ability of the thoracic spine to extend. So if you have all these things working with you, if you have ball and socket rotation, you have scapular tilt, and you have thoracic extension, and now you begin to rotate through that position, that's when you exhibit clean, full layback. The problem is a lot of guys they're just completely bound up through their soft tissues. They're completely tight through their pec minor. They're not able to get into some of these positions and create that true whip-like effect. Obviously he is, and his arm moves very, very well. Elbow pushes forward. Again, limited layback, you'll typically see the elbow push forward. So this is probably a better angle to see it. So as he rotates, where is his elbow at ball release? Well, it's roughly in plane with his shoulders. So from this angle, it's roughly straight on. Guys who push into ball release, that elbow is going to be way out here. So from a side view, you're gonna see that elbow out in front of the nose. You're gonna see them, when they hit max layback, you're gonna see this, so he's at peak layback right about here. You're gonna see it out in front of the nose. You're gonna see the elbow leading the way. Right here, the chest is leading the way, the elbow, and the arm is actually being, there's a slingshot effect where the arm is coming through at the last second and being whipped through. But again, is he hitting peak layback in front of the nose, behind the nose, ideally behind the ear, and again, he is. So he's getting a good whip-like effect there. Straight elbow, neutral wrist at release. This is going to be a little bit dependent on an athlete's range of motion. Do they have osteophytes, loose body, any sort of like joint limitation in elbow extension? This is where looking at a movement screen is helpful to see like how well do they actually have contact on the back side of the joint. Like we've seen guys where their full extension is like here. And so you're not going to see as much elbow extension at ball release, and that's okay. We probably don't want to be completely straight at ball release. There's going to be a tiny bit of flexion just for the sake of being able to decelerate and not slam the backside of the joint. But again, we want to see a little bit of bend, but we also don't want them to be coming through release at a crazy amount of elbow flexion, because again, they're just not getting that true deceleration. They're also not going to be allowing themselves to get to that full acceleration arc either. So his arm spirals out really well. You can kind of track the path that the ball takes right here. This is more of a kind of a helical circular path. The arm tracks out and around, fairly straight in elbow extension at bar release. Looks good there. Does the arm work independently of the torso? Next one that we look at is as he actually comes through ball release, is he able to finish that pitch with his arm, or does he just lump his trunk and his arm together and everything works as one just kind of blocked rotation? So just like we want to be able to basically like snap the whip, crack the whip, we want the pelvis to be able to work independently of each segment of the spine, and then we want, as soon as the spine has contributed and done its part and accelerated, we want that to decelerate, and we want that energy to be spiraling out and around into the arm. So we want the arm to be the thing that finishes the throw. We don't want the arm and the trunk to all move as one continuous circle or lumped together block rotation. So you will sometimes see this where a guy's arm is kind of compensating or guarding or protecting himself, and he's not able to actually just crack the whip and finish the throw with his arm. Everything comes together. Usually there's a head yank, usually there's a trunk over rotation or trunk yank, and it kind of pulls the arm through. So his arm does work well. His arm, you can tell that his arm is the thing finishing the throw. And I like to kind of phrase this as finishing through the tip of the whip. So is he able to finish the throw with his arm? You don't want the arm to take over the throw early and be the entire velocity generation segment of the throw. But when it is time for the arm to come into the throw, does the arm finish the throw with electricity, or does he guard the arm, protect the arm, and finish with his actual trunk and with a head yank and compensate around that? His arm, he delays bringing the arm into the throw, but when he brings the arm into the throw, the arm is what actually finishes the throw, finishing through the tip of the whip. So he does that very well. Let's look at glove arm, early supination / swimming. So you can see he's in a little bit of pronation with his glove arm. He's not immediately turned over, giving up all tension in the front side. So he's gathering, holding tension through that entire back leg, kind of spiral through the trunk, through the pelvis. But the glove arm is also serving to hold a little bit of tension there as well. So just by having it being a little bit more thumb down in this position, he's holding a little bit more tension in the front side, a little bit tension in the glove side, to be able to, when the time is right, uncoil that. If he's already here, then he's lost all tension through that front arm spiral, and there's nothing stopping the front side from being able to open up a little early. But holding a little bit more tension, just being a little bit more thumb down with that position, it's going to typically hold the glove side closed a little bit longer until the time is right. And as soon as you supinate, that can serve as a trigger for everything beginning to open up. So you can see he's pretty much thumb down, holding a little bit of tension, not supinating super early out of handbrake. And now, right now, it turns over. So that's good timing, and I am a fan of how his glove arm works from that standpoint. Does it work in opposition to his throwing arm? Again, doesn't have to be perfectly equal and opposite, but you know, are they roughly working in tandem where you know, the glove arm isn't way up here and the throwing arm's down here, and you know, the glove arm is predicting a really high arm slot like a Kenley Jansen, but you know, he's throwing sidearm, or the glove arm's here, but the throwing arm's down here and it's predicting a low arm slot, and then he comes through up top. Are they working in tandem and both being able to sink into the plane of his trunk rotation? And I mean, it's pretty clear the answer is yes. So you can see there's a little bit of symmetry here as he actually begins to rotate. That glove arm kind of screws him into that plane of rotation. So he gets here, and then as he begins to rotate, it screws him into his particular plane of rotation, which is again more of an east-west rotation. If he was going to be more of a north-south guy, he'd be in a similar position, probably a little bit more trunk tilt, probably a little bit more elevated glove side. But again, it would be the same thing. It would screw him down into the plane of that rotation. So it's just a matter of what direction you're rotating. Is the glove arm screwing into that, or is the glove arm like way out here, way down here, but he's keeping it in plane, and it's unloading with proper timing. Retraction, abduction into landing. We already talked about the scap retraction on the throwing side. We look at the glove side, same thing. So he is getting into retraction. Could he be a hair more closed in a perfect world? Yes, but is it a problem? Probably not. Rotates in plane of shoulder rotation, we just talked about that. Let's look at the lead leg now. So leaks / swings open. So again, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong here when looking at how the lead leg actually works from when it opens. We've seen it tends to be more linked to, does it match how a pitcher's hip mobility works, just like how we talked about the back hip, holding maybe more vertical shin or maybe more of a horizontal shin angle. When it comes to the lead leg, we've seen the guys with good hip external rotation. Again, Justin Verlander, Carson Fulmer, Kelvin Herrera, like these guys typically do better by holding the pelvis closed but clearing the lead leg early. And Morton actually does that, which you can see right here. He's already in hip external rotation on that lead leg. So you could argue that it leaks open, but if that's what works best for him, then that doesn't necessarily mean it's an issue. If this is somebody with terrible hip external and really good hip internal rotation, this probably wouldn't be the ideal timing of when to open the lead leg for them. But if this was a concern, maybe in the off season, this is something you play around with for a bullpen or two. You play around with, you know, holding that lead leg closed a little bit longer. Observe if the velocity jumps, observe the feel, observe the effect on pitch command, etc., and see if that's something worth pursuing. That's something that is going to click very quickly for a guy if it's going to work. It's not something to continue just bulldozing your way through his mechanics if his body's not immediately responding to it, in my opinion, at least for a high-level guy like this. Front foot contact. Again, not really a right or wrong. Here, we just want to observe what happens. Personally, I like seeing when guys land evenly on their foot. They can immediately get into that stable lead leg block with no delay. If they land on the heel and then the next frame they're down, that's a half frame. That's a millisecond that they're not able to stabilize right away on the lead leg. Guys that land more on the toe, typically they're the guys where their upper half is a lot more forward. They're not staying as back into their backside, and so they're kind of crashing down onto their toe. Guys who are pretty stacked in a good loaded position, generally they're going to land pretty even on that front foot. And so what happens there is now we're in a very stable position to actually block the lead leg and allow the hips to then continue accelerating. And then, after they finish accelerating, to be able to decelerate too. So I see no problem with this. He gets a firm plant. However, on this particular throw, as he begins to rotate, his cleats actually slip a little bit on the dirt. We have multiple clips of him. This didn't happen every throw, but occasionally he would actually lose, his cleats would lose footing on the dirt. So that is a consideration, especially if you're throwing on a high school mound, college mound, your cleats are wearing out. That can be a minor energy leak, like not necessarily a problem with his mechanics, but with the efficiency of this exact throw. Like, did he just bleed 2 miles an hour because his front foot slipped? Yeah, probably. So just something to look at, maybe footwear, maybe the cleats are worn down, maybe it was just one throw or a couple of throws. Paw back mechanism, this is one of his strengths, exceptional lead leg action. So he gets that front foot down, and then you watch that knee, and you watch this knee angle. So he shouldn't continue sinking into knee flexion beyond this point. So he plants, sticks it, and then he gets that good knee extension. Again, his knee is not being, his quad is not pushing him back. He's not pushing back into knee extension. The front foot is down, and it allows his pelvis to continue rotating. And so this glove side pelvis, as it continues to rotate back in this direction, and the arm side of his pelvis rotates forward, as it continues to clear through, he's actually pulling this knee, it's pulling on this femur, which pulls this knee into extension. So the paw back mechanism is really just having a firm plant and continuing to rotate the pelvis. And the paw back mechanism will happen on its own. Right, so it's not one of these things where we need to really cue it a lot in most cases. It happens on its own. If you get a good plant, you keep the upper half back, and you can just rotate into that. The paw back mechanism will happen on its own. And we have a number of drills that we show guys to be able to work on that, such as the lasso drill, a number of core velo belt variations can also help this as well. Knee stabilization, transverse plane. So this is from foot plant. Sorry, 1 second. So we'll go to the front view. From foot plant, does the knee continue to move out? We already talked about frontal plane, but does the knee continue to bow out towards first base, towards the glove side? Or does it stick? And you can see he sticks it exceptionally well. So his knee should not touch the cursor from here as he continues. Like it should not, the kneecap should not end up over here. So you can see he sticks it very, very well. Guys who have ankle sprains, guys who have knee issues, guys who have limited hip internal rotation, or they land way too closed, or they stride way too cross body, they're gonna run out of room in this leg spiral to actually rotate into that block. And you'll see the foot start to come off the ground, you'll see the knee bow out, and you'll see kind of things begin to collapse here. But he's a great example of what happens when you have good stability and mobility through that block, and you can really rotate into something stable and take up all that slack in the lead leg. Frontal plane, you're really just looking at that from the side, and that's what we already talked about. It's from front to back. No, so not from side to side, but from front to back. Does that knee stabilize? And you can see front to back, it stabilizes very well. We're on 10% battery on my computer, so we're gonna get through these last couple ones pretty quickly. Deceleration, so we talked about acceleration. Acceleration should happen kind of one segment at a time. Pelvis goes, then segmentally through the spine, and then ultimately that's going to work its way out and around through the arm into elbow extension, then it's internal rotation, and then the arm is the thing that finishes the throw. But what happens then? It's still a segmental deceleration now. So what we're ideally looking for is forearm releases. So now we go back through the arm spiral in the opposite direction. Forearm pronation happens. Now shoulder internal rotation happens. Now the scapula needs to be able to release. Now the trunk has to be able to continue to rotate. Right, so there's a sequence to the deceleration as well. So what you'll see is that if guys are missing, shoulder range of motion, they get through ball release, and then they just kind of like chicken wing their they're finished because they don't have the elbow extension, or they don't have the shoulder internal rotation, or they don't have the forearm pronation, or the scapula doesn't actually work that well out front, or their thoracic spine doesn't work that well. And so you get these very like slamming arm actions, slamming deceleration patterns, and guys will present with all these impingement type symptoms or posterior cuff pain, and it can a lot of times be narrowed down to somewhere in that deceleration sequence and chain it's not functioning properly. So does his forearm pronate through the ball? You can see right there, he gets turned over. Does the shoulder internally rotate? You can see right there it does. He's finishing. Again, we can't tell the exact amount. We're going to see in a movement screen is where you would see, you know, the range of motion that an athlete has accessible to him in the movement screen. So these are things that we're gathering and cross-referencing. Does the scap release into protraction, or is he stuck back here, or is he actually able to get out front and allow the scapula to move around the rib cage? It appears so. Thoracic flexion, so once he runs out of room there, does he actually have allow himself to continue to decelerate over a longer range of motion? You can see that he does. The trunk continues to rotate through while keeping the eyes on the pitch, on the target there. No violent recoil or arm slam. Again, there can be times when cueing a big recoil finish can actually help guys because they don't decelerate very well. So I'm not anti recoil, but it's something to take note of. The guys who have a really ridiculous, consistent arm slam, I have seen anecdotally a little bit of linkage to some issues. It's something to keep an eye on. It's something to continue looking into, and we have used kind of pimp the finish cues with success at times. But when you look at a lot of the healthiest pitchers long term, you look at Nolan Ryan, you look at guys like that, like they didn't have these completely violent recoil. So I think we're going to learn more over the next decade, and even over the next 5 years, you know, about the role of kind of the recoil and what exactly that lends itself to in the throw, and if that is really an injury predictor or a performance predictor as well. So it's something we take note of now. We do have guys that have recoils, and we haven't changed them in everybody, but again, something to take a note of. And the final ones, overall tempo. So most athletes will give us, this is a slow-mo video because we can, but most pitchers will send us standard video, which is 30 frames per second. And one of the things that I learned from, studying Paul Nyman, 15 years ago, is the way he would kind of standardize and quantify tempo, or how quickly an athlete moves from peak leg lift to bar release, was he would count frames. So standard video, 30 frames per second, he would go to peak leg lift, so right about here, and from there he would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and he would count the frames. And again, this is a much higher frame rate video. I think this is 120 frames per second, but he would count them and count how many frames from that point to ball release. And again, hard throwers typically were in the 20 frames to 24 frames from peak leg lift to ball release, right there. Tom House also saw that quick tempos typically corresponded to hard throwers. So generally, we're just looking for a quick tempo that falls somewhere in that range. An extremely slow tempo is typically a sign of energy leakage, but at the same time, there is such a thing as too fast. Just stepping down the mound without loading into the backside, without gathering, you also see velocity decrease there. So I've had guys on both ends of the spectrum where slowing them down is the right answer, but also where speeding them up can be the right answer. And it's just trying to find that kind of ideal blend where they still have a gather and they hold the backside and they create tension and they have time to get the arm up, but at the same time not being so fast that they're they're not getting that true lower half loading and unloading pelvic loading potential. Overall rhythm, we're just looking at the flow and the sequence and smoothness of the overall delivery. Most people have a pretty good eyeball for like, oh, that guy has a smooth delivery. Like, it's aesthetically pleasing to watch Jacob deGrom throw, or Charlie Morton throw for that matter. It's aesthetically pleasing, and we can see when someone's choppy, disconnected, and it doesn't look as pleasing from an energy transfer standpoint. But rhythm, this is more subjective, but it is something we kind of make a note on. properly timed intent comes, it's very similar to rhythm, but it's how well do you delay the actual intensity in the throw, delay the arm coming into the throw. And so, you know, sometimes we'll actually look at, you know, the facial expression. You can sometimes see like when do they start kind of grimacing, but also just observing how the arm moves. You can tell the guys where their first move is to just muscle up, you know, yank the arm up into position, and they come out of the lower half early, and their arm is the main thing guiding the throw. These are the guys that typically run out of steam earlier in outings. Their velocity drops off, their arm gets tired, they get a lot more sore than the guys who allow that energy to flow through their delivery and allow the arm to be that very final piece of the chain, a very final sequence in that kinematic sequence. So properly timed intent, again, it's subjective in terms of what we're looking at here, but how well do they delay bringing the arm into the throw, right? It's that idea of like Mozart, like flowing through it, and then last second Metallica, it's bringing the intensity, bringing the thunder, finishing with electricity at the last possible instant. And then, you know, final thing that we look for that, you know, didn't really fit into a category is cervical position. So again, we talked about, you know, looking down potentially, you know, has some benefit, but at some point in delivery, you're going to look at the target, and to be able to keep your front shoulder closed while still being able to get your eyes on the target, right? If you're so counter rotated and you have no mobility in your neck, well, you can't actually look at the target. So what do? Well, you look at the target, but your front shoulder has to open up, right? I've had pitchers, just happened, one of our guys, where, you know, he slept on his neck wrong, and he was a little bit limited to that side, to his glove side in cervical rotation, neck rotation. And so he was down a couple miles an hour. He was feeling his front side open up because he needed to look at the target, but he couldn't look at the target while staying closed. So he looked at the target, but it actually opened him up a few degrees. And again, he felt a couple mile an hour. We observed a couple mile an hour drop, but he felt that in his delivery. He felt the limit in his neck. So a lot of guys will come to us with super gritty scalenes, super, you know, ton of neck issues, or even if they don't have neck issues, they don't move that well. They try to rotate and they can't rotate without that opposite shoulder hiking up. That's something that we need to clean up. That can absolutely be a linkage and a factor in early torso rotation, in command, and all these other things. So I know I've given you guys a lot. You know, this is, again, just one piece of what we look at. We're looking at their movement screen, we're interviewing them, they're answering, you know, our athletes are answering a ton of questions, we're taking in the context, we're taking in the injury history, but this is just one piece of what we look at in terms of figuring out big picture, what might be going on, what changes might be worth pursuing. You're usually going to see a lot more red on here, but you know, Morton is just an example of a really clean delivery, and you know, thought you guys can just hopefully pick something away from this, treat this as kind of like a crash course in high-level pitching mechanics. So if you guys enjoyed this, drop a comment down below, give this video a thumbs up. Let me know who you'd like to see me break down next. Again, not going to do these super long form breakdowns all the time because it can get a little bit repetitive. I like to just take guys in general and like highlight the 2 to 3 things that they do that's unique or different. But let me know who you'd like to see me break down next, if you found this helpful, if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again.